Well, thanks for the introduction, Mark. And my name is Matt Jargowsky, and I work for Maryland DNR, and I'm really excited to present to you guys today. I want to talk about the biology kind of history of American hickory shad and then how they're doing in Maryland as a whole, but some basic biology. And hickory shad are usually smaller. They have that distinct underbite, and hickory shad often have a purplish hue. However, American shad and hickory shad often, depending on the river you're in, often have different types of colorations. Like I know the ones in the Potomac, their caudal fin also often has that black margin to it. So these colorations aren't exact, but oftentimes the American shad will be a little bit more paler, and obviously the top and bottom jaws align. Hickory shad also usually arrive a little bit earlier than American shad. That's because they prefer slightly cooler temperatures for spawning. Peaks are generally around March to April, whereas American shad April to May. But as I said with the color, the spawning runs really vary a lot depending on where you're at. Even within Maryland, the shad will run a lot earlier in the Potomac than the Susquehanna, which makes sense because obviously the Potomac's draining from a much lower area in the United States compared to the Susquehanna, which is draining from New York. So it warms up a lot quicker. So even within Maryland, you have a lot of variation in your spawning runs. Another big difference is that hickory shad females often return at age 4, whereas American shad females return at age 5. So it's always a good reminder, if you catch an American shad and it spawns that year, you won't be seeing that offspring until if it's a female for about another 5 years. So if you have a really strong year of American shad, hickory shad fishing, it's going to take a couple years until you can see the fruits of that spawning activity. And one of the biggest differences between the two is that hickory shad generally do not travel as far upstream, whereas American shad will essentially go as far as they can up a river. As I mentioned here when I talk about Susquehanna, the American shad are known to travel hundreds of miles up a river to reach the spawning grounds, whereas hickory shad don't travel quite as far, and they're also more likely to be found in small creeks. So actually some of the best hickory shad fishing you can have is in some smaller creeks such as Deer Creek, Octoraro Creek, and other places such as that. So for some historic shad populations, I'm sure most of you guys are aware, but they're one of the most important, if not the most important fish in North America. It's actually led to what was called the Shad Wars. If you guys aren't familiar with that, essentially in the 1800s, you had issues where downstream residents were setting up dams and fishing weirs, which were preventing the shad from then traveling upstream. And because the American shad were such an important part of people's lives in the 1800s, it led to fights and murder. And in fact, they had actually have shad wardens whose job was to go along the river and make sure that the water is being used fairly. So just gives you an idea of how important shad were for the history of America. Unfortunately, this is also where we started seeing the first signs of population declines. Jim Thompson will get more into dam restorations, but once you start sectioning off some of these spawning runs, you're basically cutting off that spawning habitat for the shad and you're limiting their populations. But then their populations, unfortunately, for both American and hickory shad really declined throughout the 20th century, with habitat loss, mainly blockages through dams being one of the primary reasons, as well as overfishing. But it's important when I mentioned overfishing that I'm not just talking about in river. It's oftentimes easiest for to think of as shad fishermen to think of in river fishing, but these fish spend the majority of their lives actually out in the ocean. So particularly in the 70s, there was a lot of fishing for American shad and things like Atlantic mackerel and Atlantic herring, where these fish were also being caught. So it's important to remember that they're not susceptible for fishing. They're susceptible to fishing more than when they're just in the rivers. And lastly, invasive predators, so that's obviously more of a recent issue, at least when we're talking about Maryland. To give you an idea of this population declines, you can see these are commercial landings in Virginia and Maryland back in 1950. And you can see really how quickly these dropped off. We're going from easily getting almost 5 million pounds a year in the 1950s to under 1 million in the 1980s. And really all the landings you see after 1980 was mostly that ocean fishery, as most of the state waters had been closed to shad fishing around that time. But then to give you even more historical perspective, that figure only dates back to where that red line is. So this is estimates of Potomac shad landings. Really before that, it's kind of more historical reading. So the data isn't quite as robust as some of the previous figures, but it just gives you an idea that even before 1950, shad were already seeing declines due to dams and overfishing. So this decline happened throughout the whole coast. Even though these shad return to their natal rivers of spawn, so shad that spawn in the Potomac will generally, the juveniles will go back out to the ocean and generally return back to the Potomac, but they often mix a lot out on the ocean. So you don't, essentially you have the Potomac River fish swimming with fish from Maryland, Virginia, and they all mix together. So across the coast, there was not really any shad populations that did not experience severe declines. And I'm also talking about hickory shad too. Most of the data is for American shad just because they were historically of the two, the more important fish commercially, but hickory shad were caught in tandem with American shad in commercial fisheries. And if you look at recreational fishing reports, rivers and creeks that once had historically really strong hickory spawns with great fishing, you can see in the early 1980s, hickory shad spawning runs in Deer Creek, Octorara Creek, Northeast Creek were reported to essentially have disappeared. So both these species experienced really sharp declines in the 1980s. This led to statewide moratoriums in the 80s for both American shad, both Maryland, the Potomac, as well as Virginia, and also for hickory shad. However, that ocean fishery, that directed ocean fishery, did not close till 2005. And obviously now in the United States, you're not allowed to target American shad in the Atlantic. However, they're still caught as bycatch in the Atlantic mackerel and Atlantic herring fisheries. So that kind of led to the start of restoration. As I mentioned, that historic declines in the 1980s. So starting around this time, you had hatcheries starting to stock fry in the Susquehanna and the Potomac. And in fact, over 200 million American shad have been stocked by the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission since the late 70s. And Maryland DNR has also stocked over 50 million American shad and 100 million hickory shad in Maryland waters other than the Potomac since the 90s. And in the Potomac itself, over 25 million American shad were stocked just between 1995 and 2015. And with this graph, don't worry about what the y-axis represents, but the main thing you see here is this is bay-wide landings from our juvenile seine surveys. And we can see back to 1959 to present day that we have more juvenile American shad now throughout Maryland than we did 60 years ago. Again, it's important to note that this is in the Potomac landings, that this number 60 years ago isn't where American shad numbers were historically or where we want to get them to go. But the main thing is that these early restoration efforts have shown progress, and American shad, while it's been unfortunately kind of a slow process, they have been increasing throughout Maryland. Now I'm going to switch to talking a bit about the Susquehanna. The Susquehanna and Potomac are the two biggest river basins that flow into the Chesapeake Bay. So really, how hickory shad and American shad are doing in the Chesapeake and in Maryland can a lot of times be attributed to how they're doing in specific rivers. As I mentioned before, American shad historically traveled up more than 300 miles upstream the Susquehanna up into New York. However, big hydropower dams were built near the mouth of the river in the early 1900s, and that essentially stopped all upstream passage. So what was historically a huge, important part of the Susquehanna River was essentially stopped in the early 1900s. However, while this was once, their spawning grounds were cut off, fish lifts started being installed in these dams in the late 1970s. And so you get an idea how these lifts originally worked was in 1982 to 2000, fish were lifted at Conowingo Dam, which is this first dam about 5 miles up the mouth of the Susquehanna River. They were then put in a tank and trucked and transported past the York Haven Dam, which is the last of these 4 big, large hydropower dams, which essentially opened up 70 miles of spawning habitat for these American shad. And if you don't think, and just to give you an idea how important the spawning habitat is, once we started doing that, the American shad population skyrocketed. We went from lifting less than 1,000 fish in the 80s to, in 2001, lifting over 200,000 fish. And everything looked really great. And in fact, in 2000, the last of the fish, all 4 dams now had fish passage installed. And so they switched to volitional passage, which basically meant instead of the fish being transported from Conowingo Dam past York Haven Dam, the fish were essentially just put upstream of the dam and then allowed to swim to the next dam. So essentially, if they wanted to get past York Haven Dam, they had to go over 4 fish lists instead of 1. However, this also opened up some spawning habitat in between the dams. And you may ask, why did they switch to this instead of truck and transporting fish since it works so well? Well, one of the issues is that truck and transporting was already being maxed out. You can only put so many fish in a truck and put them upstream in a year. And with the population increases, why they're great, they're already kind of reaching the maximum number of fish they could transport. So they wanted to potentially make a way for shad to get from the hundreds of thousands to the millions. It also, if you sort the fish, it takes a lot more time. If you think about it, if you're lifting the fish over the dam and simply dumping on the other side, you can do that in a matter of minutes. But when you have to sort the fish to remove the American shad, to put in a tank, transport upstream, that takes time. You have to sort through thousands of fish, most of which often aren't American shad. And this also results in more stress for the fish because instead of the fish being simply lifted up with a bunch of other fish and put upstream of the dam, they then were then sorted, lifted up, the water was slightly drained, the American shad were netted out, put in another tank, then that tank was moved and then netted out of that tank and then put in another tank. So you can see this created a lot more stress. So this was seen as the ideal way to help restore shad populations in the Susquehanna. But unfortunately, while hopes were high, the shad populations kind of quickly declined after that. Unfortunately, it seemed like while getting them past the Conowingo Dam was potentially enough to restore shad populations, all 4 fish lists working together weren't efficient enough to help sustain these shad populations. So unfortunately, we saw declines pretty soon after. And so that may lead you to wonder, well, what's now for American shad and Susquehanna? We saw great promise, and then unfortunately that reversed. Well, the one big thing is that starting last year, truck and transport resumed. So this actually, it was going to be resumed anyway, but actually came into benefit due to invasive species as blue catfish and snakeheads started showing up in low numbers at the Conowingo Dam. So by sorting the fish and then transporting and then putting them in a separate tank to transport, they're able to actually still help the shad get upstream of the dam, but also they're able to remove the invasive blue catfish and snakeheads while they're sorting the fish. There was also plans for all 4 of the hydropower dams to improve the fish passage. One of the major things is when you're installing these fish passage projects, you need the fish to use the actual fish list. So they're working on ways to help improve the shad find these fish lists. So now I'll switch over to the Potomac. Obviously, the Potomac has a rich history dating all the way back to George Washington. As I mentioned before, you can read. There's tons of literature out there about how important American shad were to the Americans in the 17 and 18, really 1900s. And DNR does monitor the shad populations on this river, primarily through their striped bass surveys, which include a juvenile seine survey, which I presented some data to earlier, and a striped bass spawning stock survey, which uses a gill net, which also catches American shad. And as I'm sure many of you guys are aware, populations have increased since the late 90s. And here's another figure where you don't really have to worry about what the y-axis means, but the main thing is that you're seeing that line increasing. And that's really exciting. Unfortunately, American shad aren't doing great across the coast, and lots of places have not seen increases of American shad. Their populations have maybe increased a little bit, or they increased in rivers where they've done habitat restoration, but really the increase we've seen in the Potomac has been pretty great. And especially when we look at the juvenile production, we can see really American shad are doing much better than they were 60 years ago. Again, that's kind of a large, we want to shoot for better than that, but still, it's really great to see American shad improving. However, many of you may have seen a report that came out after the 2020 Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission stock assessments that said, unfortunately, they labeled American shad populations in the Potomac River as unsustainable. And so this confused a lot of people because obviously, as I just showed you in the previous graphs, American shad they seem to be doing great. Their numbers are increasing. So why would the Atlantic states say that American shad are unsustainable? Well, I can kind of answer that just by looking at some of Maryland's data. While more than just Maryland's data went into the assessment, especially the Potomac data, what happened in the report was also pretty much reflected with Maryland data as well. And what's important to notice in this report is that they are primarily interested in American shad populations from 2005 to 2017. And this is because in 2005 is when the coastwide ocean fisheries for American shad stopped. So they wanted to know, did American shad increase from the stoppage of the ocean fisheries till the end of the data they had for the assessment, which is 2017. And while they said American shad had increased since the 90s in the Potomac, when they looked at this data, when the models were run, they were not able to say, in fact, that the Potomac American shad were increasing, which you can kind of see what they're talking about, because we kind of reached like a slight peak in our increase, and then there was unfortunately a slight decline, which then increased again. But if you're just looking at this subset of data without without the 2018 to 2022 data, you can kind of see why they weren't so quick to say American shad are necessarily increasing in the Potomac. And the juvenile data kind of showed the same thing. Again, if you just look at that 2005 to 2017 and don't look at the 2015 juvenile class, you can see again, it kind of looks stable. And the biggest thing was adult mortality. If you read the report, which it's long and I don't expect anyone to, but if you read the summary of the report, the main thing they said was adult mortality was unsustainable. And the way mortality is calculated is it's based off the ages of the fish. So if you guys are unaware, you can age American shad by taking their scales and looking at them underneath the microscope and aging them kind of similar to rings on a tree. And unfortunately, this data showed that American shad mortality was increasing. And this dotted line can be thought of as kind of the sustainability threshold, where adult mortality levels below that line are good, and that means sustainable, but estimates above that are bad, and that means potentially unsustainable. However, the data is somewhat, it's contradictory, because usually when you have increasing populations of a fish, that corresponds with decreasing mortality levels, which makes sense, right? If you're getting more fish, then that probably means less fish are dying. So while the report labeled the American shad as unsustainable, it's important to note that even within the report itself, it says that the results of that assessment, especially for the Potomac, should not be used in fisheries management, particularly because the data themselves have a lot of uncertainty to them. But you may ask, well, why did potentially mortality increase for American shad? Well, the first thing I want to say is that we're just aging them. We're estimating this mortality based on these scale measurements, but it's not an exact science. There's error to this data, and there's stuff that we're potentially missing. So there's obviously one potential reason why mortality was high is just because the way we're estimating mortality was missing something. But another possible reason is that this is from that same adult striped bass spawning stock survey. This is blue catfish caught in the Potomac. And unfortunately, you can see since 1996, the blue catfish essentially increased at a pretty linear rate. And what's also important to note is that American shad are obviously eaten by striped bass, but if you add a new predator American shad that can feed on not only the juveniles, but the adult American shad, this could potentially lead to some mortality. And it's also important to look at the max size of fish caught in a gill net. So not only did the fish show up, but they're getting bigger over time. So potentially what's happening is that we had some increase in mortality of American shad during this time, possibly due to some of these larger catfish. Catfish, they eat lots of things and they don't specialize on American shad, so it could be unrelated, but they're nonetheless, we know they feed on American shad, so it's certainly a possibility. But luckily, one of the few times you can say, I guess if you like fishing for blue catfish, you may not agree with this, but one of the few good populations declines that American shad, at least in our surveys, have shown a pretty steep decline in recent years in the Potomac. So potentially this increase in adult mortality is going to reverse, and especially considering shad populations were increasing even with this increased mortality, this could potentially be a really good sign for American shad. It's also worth noting that since the SOC assessment happened, our striped bass survey, 4 of the highest estimates in the history of the survey happened since the end of the assessment. So while they weren't sure maybe up until 2017 if shad were increasing, it certainly seems like American shad were increasing post then. So this kind of reinforces the fact that while maybe we had a slight dip in American shad populations around 2010, it's pretty clear that we've had a constant increase. And we see this with the juvenile data as well. When you really look at that data from 2005 to 2022, you can see a pretty strong increase in our juvenile numbers. We may have had a slightly decrease, poor spawning year in 2022, but that may have actually kind of gone back to those water temperatures that you guys saw earlier. Another interesting fact is that 2022 was also the lowest adult mortality estimate for our data in history of survey, which kind of leads credence to sometimes these data don't show everything that you expect, because you wouldn't expect adult mortality to go to the highest in the history of survey to the lowest. But what happens in 2022 in our data is we actually had an average size, these with mean fork length in millimeters of American shad. It was the lowest in the history of survey. And this was because we had lots of age 4 males. I mentioned earlier that the females often return at age 5. Well, the males often return at age 4 1 year earlier. And so what we haven't had was a lot of these really small males. And what I hopefully think this means is that since we had a strong year class of those age 4 males, hopefully those age 4 males return this year again as age 5, but hopefully those females that were still out in the ocean last year will be returning. So I'm pretty hopeful that 2023 is going to be a really strong year, because if it matches, the number of age 5 females matches their male counterparts, it should be a really strong year in 2023. I mean, lots of stuff can happen. Unfortunately, the shadow around the ocean where anything can happen, but I'm pretty hopeful it's going to be a really strong year for 2023. And so lastly, before I kind of summarize stuff, I wanted to go over some of our recreational fishing surveys. Maryland DNR has 2 shad surveys. One is a creel survey that happens at Conowingo Dam, where we survey anglers fishing for American and hickory shad. And the other is a logbook survey, and anyone who fishes in Maryland for American hickory shad can participate in the survey. However, for American shad, most of our responses have kind of been concentrated near the Susquehanna River. And so for American shad fishing in 2022, it was a pretty poor year. Again, for this data, it's mostly constricted to the Susquehanna River. But what happened in the Susquehanna was kind of similar to what seemed to happen in the Potomac, in that the water was cool for a really long time. And then once it started warming up and kind of reaching your peak shad run times or run temperatures, we had a really high flow event that unfortunately closed the dam and led to really high flows and kind of pushed the shad down the river. So it was kind of a poor year for shad fishing in the Susquehanna in 2022, but this was mostly seemed to be due to simply, unfortunately, cool water temperatures and high flow events at inopportune times. However, I know most of you guys fish in the Potomac, but if you are interested in fishing at Conowingo, what's really cool is that the Fish and Wildlife Service website has a weekly passage count for the Conowingo Dam. So if you are interested in fishing the Susquehanna River, you can check this website weekly. You can also find it just by Googling Susquehanna shad passage numbers, and you can check to see how many American shad were lifted that week. So you can really wait to see when the American shad are in fact showing up at the Susquehanna River. And then when you want to fish at the dam, the first thing you want to do probably is call the Conowingo Generation Hotline. And in this, if you call this number, it's an automatic, they have a voice recorded message, and it will tell you whether or not Fisherman's Park is open. Usually Fisherman's Park is open as long as the dam's not flood, but if you call this number around 5 o'clock the day before, they'll confirm to you whether or not the fishing is opening at the dam. And the last thing you want to do is check the Mariota water gauge. This is the USGS water gauge, and the main thing you want to check here is to make sure that Conowingo is not going to go into spill conditions. If that Mariota water gauge starts trending upwards towards potential action, this means Conowingo Dam is going to spill, which means Conowingo or Fisherman's Park will be closed. So this happens once or twice a year. So if you are planning to make the trip up from DC to the Conowingo Dam, you can really, you have a lot of tools available to make sure you don't kind of go up there and unfortunately get skunked or have the part or the fishing be closed. Now, I've talked a lot about American shad. However, I also want to talk briefly about hickory shad. So this is the recreational the results are recreational surveys for hickory shad, and you can see that both in our creel survey at Conowingo Dam and our logbook surveys, it was a banner year for hickory shad. This dates back to 2001, and we had a record number of hickory shad in terms of fish caught per hour by our anglers. So that was really exciting to see. And I know even from talking to some biologists who work on the Potomac that they saw the same thing, lots of hickory shad. I think that could partially be due to the fact that the water seemed to be a little cooler for a little bit longer this year, but it was really exciting to see such great hickory shad numbers this year. And when looking at this data, the best hickory shad fishing in 2022 from our data was Octorero Creek, which is the tributary that's just downstream of Conowingo Dam, Elk River and Creek, Deer Creek, which is kind of one of the last tributaries at the mouth of the Susquehanna right before it empties out into the Chesapeake Bay, Mattawoman Creek, which I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with, and then the Conowingo Dam tail race and the Susquehanna River. You can catch hickory shad at the dam, but usually their numbers aren't. If you're going hickory shad fishing, there's better places to go, though you will catch them fishing for American shad at the dam. Lastly, I also wanted to give a quick plug. If you guys are obviously, I'm sure most of you are potentially submitting your data elsewhere, but if you do want to contribute to any of Maryland's recreational surveys, you can scan this QR code or just Google Maryland Shad Survey. And we have an online survey where if you're interested, you can go on and log how many fish you caught that day. This is for people targeting American shad, or hickory shad. So if you're targeting either of those, we'd really love it if you want to go in there and just say how many you caught and how long you're fishing. As I mentioned, we have lots of coverage kind of in the upper bay, but we'd love some more anglers from Southern Maryland. We do ask if you do report this, also record the days that you didn't catch any. Since we're trying to get an idea of how many American shad they were, if you only report the days where you go out and you catch 20 or 30 American shad, you can will unfortunately overestimate how many American shad there were. So if you do contribute, we do appreciate too if you report days where maybe don't catch as much. We also send out paper log books if you prefer to do it or pencil and paper. If you're interested in that, just email me. It's matthew.jargowsky@maryland.gov. I'll be happy to send you a paper log book. So you just fill it out, and once you're done shad fishing, send it back. And at the end of the year, if you contribute to this in any way, we send a yearly report that just shows how many American shad and hickory shad were caught, as well as how that catch per hour has changed over the past 20 years. So with that, I want to wrap stuff up. Again, what's the future of American shad in Maryland? Well, for one, I'm really optimistic. In the Potomac, American shad are doing great. And then the Susquehanna, with the trap and transport program restarting and the improvements to fish passage, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll start seeing increases there again. So it's important to remember, since it takes 5 years for these shad to reach maturity and then return to spawn, that we won't see any improvements right away. It takes a while before we start seeing improvements, but I think we will start seeing those improvements in about 4 to 5 years in the Susquehanna. And again, the Potomac is really promising despite the unsustainable level. I wouldn't worry, if you read anything about it, I really wouldn't worry about about American shad being considered unsustainable on the Potomac. The main thing is, as long as the American shad numbers keep increasing, that's the main thing to pay attention to. And even since the assessment, the data have been pretty promising. So again, American shad in the Potomac, it's been really exciting to see them increasing, and hopefully they continue to do it. Like I said, I think 2023 is gonna be a really good year, especially hopefully those H5 females return. And lastly, just to wrap things up, 2022 was a great year for hickory shad, and hopefully that'll roll over into another great year in 2023. So I covered a lot of information there, but if you have any questions now, or if you want to go to Jim's presentation, you can always email me later too, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right,